I've watched a lot of men make the mistake of measuring what a person is worth before they've had the chance to prove it. In most cases, it costs them an apology at most. In Cole Ramsay's case, it nearly cost him the animal that held his entire operation together. And though he wouldn't have admitted it at the time, considerably more than that. Cole Ramsay ran 300 head of Hereford cattle on a quarter section of foothills land west of Pincher Creek, Alberta, in the autumn of 1893. He was 42 years old and had been running that land alone for 9 years. Since his father's death left him the property and the debts that came with it. He was not by any measure his neighbors used, a man who invited company or welcomed opinions that hadn't been asked for. His hired man, a quiet matey fellow named Alphonse, had worked the place for 6 of those 9 years and had learned in that time not to offer suggestions unless directly prompted, which was rare. The animal at the center of Cole's current difficulty was a Hereford bull named Sergeant, a name Cole had given him as a joke 7 years ago that had long since stopped being funny. Sergeant was the reason Cole's herd graded out higher than anything else in that end of the valley. He was also, as of 3 weeks prior, dying of something no one could correctly identify or successfully treat. 2 veterinarians from Macleod had come out, examined the bull and offered diagnoses that contradicted each other, and treatments that failed on the same timeline. The third man, who had come from as far as Calgary on the strength of a recommendation from Cole's neighbor, had looked at Sergeant for 40 minutes, charged Cole for 2 hours, and told him the animal was beyond reasonable intervention, and probably ought to be put down before the season turned. Cole had thanked the man, paid him, and said nothing further until the wagon was out of earshot. Then he had told Alphonse, in the flattest voice Alphonse had heard from him in 6 years of employment, that nobody was putting Sergeant down until Cole himself said so, and that he had one more card left to play, though he said it in a tone that made Alphonse understand the card was not one Cole was confident in. The card was a letter. He had placed a notice in 3 prairie papers the previous month, looking for someone with livestock medicine experience, who might be available for seasonal work. He'd written it vaguely, the way a man writes an advertisement he isn't sure he believes in. The response that arrived 10 days later was from a woman in Moose Jaw named Hazel Foran. Her letter was precise and without ornamentation. She wrote that she had spent 11 years working alongside her father, a licensed livestock doctor in the Northwest Territories, until his death the previous winter. She wrote that she had handled difficult cattle cases, assisted at complicated calvings, treated pneumonia in draft horses, and twice brought animals back from conditions the attending veterinarian had called terminal. She wrote that she was 34 years old, accustomed to hard work, and not interested in employment that would ask less of her than she was capable of giving. Cole read the letter twice, then set it on the table and left it there for 2 days before writing back. He was, by his own private admission, skeptical. 11 years of assisting was not 11 years of practicing. A woman writing her own credentials in her own letter was, in Cole's experience of letters, not necessarily a woman who possessed those credentials. He had hired one ranch hand on the strength of an impressive letter 6 years earlier, and spent 3 months watching the man fail at basic tasks, before finally letting him go in October. He wrote back anyway, because Sergeant was getting worse, and the alternative was doing nothing at all. Hazel Foran arrived on the stage from Lethbridge on a Thursday morning in late September, carrying a leather satchel worn smooth at the corners, and a trunk that, when it was unloaded, proved to be heavy enough that Alphonse needed Cole's help to lift it into the back of the wagon. Cole said nothing about the trunk's weight. He noted it. He also noted, without saying so, that she stepped off the stage and looked immediately at the land, the line of hills to the west, the color of the grass, the way the light was sitting on the foothills. Before she looked at either of the 2 men waiting for her, a person who looked at the land first was, in Cole's experience, either a fool or someone who already understood that land told you more in the first minute than people did in the first hour. He wasn't sure yet which she was. She introduced herself as Hazel Foran, shook his hand with a grip that surprised him, and asked about the animal before they reached the wagon. Cole gave her the short version, the diagnosis disagreements, the 3 failed treatments, the Calgary vet's recommendation. Hazel listened without interrupting, which Cole respected. When he finished, she asked 2 questions he had not expected. She asked what the bull's water source was, and whether anything had been changed in his feed in the weeks before he started showing symptoms. Cole answered both questions. Then he said, with the careful neutrality of a man managing his own expectations, that 3 experienced men had already examined Sergeant and failed to help him, and that he was not certain there was anything left to be done. Hazel looked at him with steady gray eyes, and said that she hadn't come all the way from Moose Jaw to be certain. She said she would need to examine the animal before she could tell him anything useful, and she would prefer to do it without anyone standing over her shoulder offering opinions. If that was agreeable. Cole said it was agreeable, and told Alphonse to show her to the barn. He did not follow them. He stood in the yard for a moment after they disappeared through the barn door, and looked at the western hills, the way he did when he was working through a problem he hadn't solved yet, and then went back to the work the morning had already set in front of him. What he did not tell Hazel Foran, because it was not the kind of thing Cole Ramsay told anyone, was the full weight of what Sargent represented. The breeding fees that Bull generated in a season covered the difference between a year that worked and a year that didn't. He had sold 2 calves he'd intended to keep in order to cover the veterinary costs of the past 3 weeks. If Sargent died, Cole would be breeding his herd to a neighbor's inferior stock at rates that would set him back 3 years of careful progress, in a business where 3 years was not a casual thing to lose. He had let one letter from Moose Jaw become his last practical option, because every other option had already failed, and he was aware of how thin that particular reed was to lean on. Hazel spent 2 hours in the barn with Sargent before she came to find Cole at the fence he was mending on the east pasture. She had pushed her sleeves up, and there was something dark on her left forearm that Cole chose not to ask about. She stood at the fence line and said, without preamble, that she believed she knew what was wrong with the bull, and that it was not what any of the 3 veterinarians had diagnosed. Cole set down his pliers and gave her his full attention. She explained it plainly, without the hedging language the 3 vets had all used. The way a person explains something they are genuinely certain of, rather than something they are hoping sounds convincing. She said the bull had ingested something toxic, most likely water hemlock, which could persist in poorly drained areas of a pasture, and was easily missed by anyone who hadn't thought to look for it. She said the treatments he had received had been aimed at the wrong problem entirely. She said the damage was real but not irreversible. She said she thought she could help him, but it would take time. It would not be comfortable to watch if Cole was the kind of man who found that sort of thing difficult. Cole looked at her for a moment and then asked how much time. Hazel said she wanted 3 days. She said she wouldn't promise the outcome, because she was not in the habit of promising things she couldn't control. But she said she thought the probability was better than the 3 vets had made it sound. Cole said 3 days was agreeable, and told her whatever she needed from the supply shelf in the tack room was hers to use. What he did not say, riding back toward the barn an hour later on the pretext of checking the water trough, was that he was watching her, not the way a man watches someone he distrusts, though he did not yet fully trust her, but the way a man watches someone he genuinely cannot read, which was a rarer and more unsettling experience for Cole than distrust. She had set up a system he didn't recognize. There were things from her trunk he couldn't name, and she had rearranged the stall in ways that he could see had logic to them without being able to say what the logic was. She was moving around Sargent slowly and without urgency, speaking to the animal in a voice too low for Cole to hear from the doorway. The bull, who had not been approachable for a solid week, had not tried to move away from her. Cole went back to his fence. He told himself it was 1 hour's evidence, which was not enough evidence to adjust a conclusion on. Alphonse found him at supper that evening and said, in the careful way Alphonse offered opinions he hadn't been asked for, that the woman from Moose Jaw knew what she was doing in a barn. Cole said he hadn't asked. Alphonse said he understood that and went back to his meal. Cole sat with that considerably longer than he intended. The second day brought one of the early Chinooks that occasionally moved through the Pincher Creek country in late September, warm and dry off the mountains, pushing the temperature up 20 degrees from dawn to midday. Cole used the weather to move 3 things on the fall list that couldn't wait. He checked the barn twice. The second time he stayed at the door longer than the first. Hazel was treating the bull with something applied by hand in slow, deliberate passes, talking steadily and quietly. Sargent's ears were forward. He was standing without the locked, withdrawn stillness that had characterized him for 3 weeks, and his breathing, which Cole had been watching with the particular attention of a man who didn't want to admit he was watching it, had changed in a way Cole couldn't precisely name, but couldn't dismiss either. Cole's neighbor, a man named Dougal Price who ran the next section east, rode over that afternoon on the stated purpose of returning a post-hole digger he'd borrowed in August. He had in fact heard from his hired man who had heard from Alphonse that Cole had brought someone in from Saskatchewan to try to save the bull. Dougal leaned against the barn door and watched Hazel work for 10 minutes with the careful, uncommitted expression of a man reserving judgment. After 10 minutes he said to Cole quietly that he'd had a look at the south corner of the pasture Cole had described, the poorly drained section near the creek, and that there was water hemlock along the bank there, which he recognized from a case his father had dealt with in Manitoba 30 years back. Cole said nothing for a moment, then he said he appreciated Dougal saying so. Dougal took his post-hole digger and rode home. Cole stood at the barn door for a while longer, looking at the work being done inside, and felt the particular discomfort of a man whose remaining skepticism was losing its footing without his permission. By the morning of the third day, Sargent was eating, not the dull, reluctant mouthing of an animal too weak to refuse food, but eating the way an animal eats when the body has started to remember what functioning feels like. Alphonse came to Cole before breakfast, which was not a thing Alphonse did, and said only that the bull was eating. He said it with the particular restraint of a man who understood that the fact was significant enough not to require elaboration. Cole went to the barn before he ate his own breakfast. Hazel was already there, and she looked like she had not been to bed, which she had not, though Cole only learned that later. She was watching the bull from the edge of the stall, and when Cole came through the door, she said without turning around that he was going to be all right. She said it the same way she said most things, plainly, without decoration, as a statement of something she had already verified rather than something she was hoping was true. Cole stood at the rail beside her, and they watched Sargent eat for a while in silence. Then Cole said, in the considered way of a man choosing words that had been waiting for the right moment, that 3 men with medical training had looked at the same animal and reached the wrong conclusion, and she had reached the right one from 150 miles away, on the basis of 2 questions and a 2-hour examination. Hazel said that the 3 men had been looking for what they expected to find, and that the habit of expecting a particular answer was the most reliable way she knew of missing the actual one. Cole said he reckoned that was probably true of more things than livestock medicine. Hazel looked at him then, the same steady gray eyes from the stage platform in Pincher Creek. She said that in her experience, yes, it generally was. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he owed her a proper apology before anything else, because he had read her letter from Moose Jaw and decided, without a single hour's evidence, that the credentials she described were likely exaggerated. He said he'd made that particular mistake before, with a letter from a man, and had let the one burned experience color every letter after it in a way that wasn't fair and wasn't, it turned out, accurate. Hazel said she was aware he'd been skeptical. She said most people were at the outset, and that she'd long since stopped being surprised by it, though she hadn't stopped finding it inconvenient. She said it without bitterness, which surprised Cole more than the competence had. Bitterness would have been understandable and easy to keep at arm's length. The absence of it was harder to know what to do with. Dougal Price came back that afternoon, this time with his wife Edna and without the pretense of a borrowed tool, and stood at the barn door for a good 20 minutes, watching Sargent move around the stall, with the returning confidence of an animal reclaiming his legs. Edna said to Hazel that she had heard stories about her father's work in the territories, and had not known he had a daughter who'd followed the same path. Hazel said she hadn't so much followed it, as grown up inside it until following it was the only thing that made sense. Edna looked at Cole when Hazel said that, with the particular look of a woman noting something she intended to remember. The month that followed was not a simple one. Cole was not by nature or long practice a man who revised his habits quickly. The skepticism that had accumulated over 9 solitary years of managing things without depending on anyone's judgment. But his own did not dissolve in 3 days, because those 3 days had gone well. There were mornings when he caught himself discounting Hazel's assessment of a sick calf or a lame horse, before he had a reason to. Pulling on the old reflex before he'd thought it through. What changed was that he began to notice when he was doing it, and having noticed, began to stop. Hazel for her part was not a patient woman by default. She was direct and quick in her assessments, and she had a clear, unsentimental way of telling Cole when she thought he was wrong that he found disorienting and, in time, genuinely useful. She did not soften her opinions to make them easier for him to receive. She also did not volunteer them constantly, which was the thing that made it possible for Cole to hear them when she did. She had left a situation in Moose Jaw that she told him about in pieces over the winter. A partnership arrangement with a man who had initially welcomed her competence and, then, as the months passed, found reasons to work around it. To bring in outside opinions on matters she was better positioned to judge. To let her expertise be present without being acknowledged. She had recognized the pattern because her father had warned her about it before he died. She had answered the notice in the Lethbridge paper because it described work that needed doing. And she had decided that was worth the uncertainty of a man she didn't know. Cole listened to this without interrupting, in the way he listened when something was being said that he needed to sit with, rather than respond to immediately. He said, eventually, that he reckoned he'd come within about one bad morning of being that man without meaning to. Hazel said she reckoned he probably had. She said the difference was that he'd noticed, which was not a thing she took for granted. Sargent recovered fully by the end of October and was back in service the following spring. Cole had the south pasture corner drained that winter, the water hemlock cleared, and the fence line moved to exclude the problem section from the herd's access. He told Dougal Price, when they rode the fence line together in November, that he'd done work he should have done 3 years ago. Dougal, who had watched the autumn's events from the neighboring property with considerable interest, asked Cole if he intended to keep the woman from Moose Jaw on through the season. Cole said he intended to ask her. Dougal said he thought that was a sound decision, and that Edna would be very pleased to hear it, and rode on ahead before Cole could formulate a response. He did ask her in December, on a morning when the first real snow of the season had come in overnight, and the foothills were white and still and particular. He did not ask her only to stay on through the season, he asked her more than that, and he did it in the plainest language available to him, because ornamental language had never been one of his tools, and this was not the moment to attempt it. Hazel said yes without asking for time to consider it, which he had expected she would need. She said she had decided sometime in October, approximately around the day he'd come to her, and said the thing about the burned experience and the letters. Cole said he hadn't known it showed. Hazel said most things did, to a person who had learned to look for them, rather than for what she expected to find. It was the same observation she'd made in the barn in September, applied to a different subject entirely. Cole understood she was doing it deliberately, and found that he didn't mind. They ranched the Pincher Creek property together for 27 years. Hazel treated livestock across 3 counties, because word traveled in that part of Alberta, the way it traveled everywhere that people depended on each other. And a woman who had brought an animal back from a condition 2 consecutive veterinarians had written off, was not a thing that stayed quiet for long. Cole went with her on the more difficult cases, not to help because he was not trained and he knew it, but because he had developed in those first years a genuine respect for watching her work that never quite became ordinary, no matter how many times he witnessed it. Their eldest daughter inherited her mother's eye for a sick animal, and, according to everyone who knew both of them, her father's particular stubbornness, which Hazel maintained, was the more useful of the 2 traits if it was pointed in the right direction. Their daughter liked to say that the best thing her father had ever done was write a vague notice in 3 prairie papers, and then actually listen to what the answer told him, even when listening was the harder thing. Alphonse stayed on for 14 more years, and told the story of the September sergeant, was saved to every new hand who came through the place, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been present for something and known, at the time, that it mattered. He always included the part about Cole coming to the barn before his own breakfast on the 3rd morning, because he said that was the part that told you what kind of man Cole Ramsay finally turned out to be. I have thought about that autumn in Pincher Creek many times since I first heard the story told, and what I keep returning to is this. The 3 veterinarians who failed were not incompetent men, they were experienced and trained, and they had looked at the evidence in front of them and reached conclusions that fit the pittance they already carried. The problem was not their knowledge. It was what their knowledge had done to their willingness to look past what they expected to see. Hazel Foran walked into a barn with a worn leather satchel, and a lifetime of experience she had never been fully permitted to use, and she asked 2 questions nobody had thought to ask, and she found what nobody else had found, because she hadn't started with the answer. Cole Ramsay was not a different kind of man before she arrived. He was a careful man who had been burned once, and had let his caution harden into something that looked like good judgment, because he never had to see what it was costing him. The cost, until that September, had been invisible. The debt he paid after was a different kind entirely. A willingness to hold his own conclusions lightly enough to let the evidence revise them. A willingness to let someone he had hired on the strength of one letter be exactly as capable as that letter had said she was, without requiring her to prove it twice. Tell me something if you're willing. Has there been a moment in your own life when you watched someone's competence dismantle a doubt you'd been carrying longer than you realized? Leave it in the comments. I find those are often the moments people remember most clearly, even years later. The afternoon the proof arrived, and the doubt finally had nowhere left to stand.